Hi, this is Lauren from Lemon Sky Actions, LSP Actions, and I'm going to be talking you through how to create your own frequency separation layers and explain the process a little bit behind frequency separation for those who think it's just a big scary word. Frequency separation basically means separating the high frequencies, which is the texture of your image, the highlights and the shadows that form texture, and the low frequencies, which is the tones, the colours, the undertones of your image. Separating these into two separate layers means you can work individually on the colours and the textures of your image with a lot more non-destructively than you could if you were working on a flat image. I'm going to try and explain this as best I can, but those that know me know I tend to ramble. I'm non-scripted, so please forgive me if I ramble on. I will try not to. Okay, so as you can see here on my screen, we have the word frequency. Can you see that? It's quite small. It says frequency. This is actually a low frequency layer. It's very, very blurry. And what happens if I begin to zoom in to the low frequency layer? Oh, look, separation. Can you see that? Separation is created as a high frequency layer, and the word frequency I created as a low frequency layer. So now, unless you step very far away from the screen or perhaps blur and squint your eyes, you cannot see the word frequency. However, if I zoom out, there we go. Frequency separation. Frequency separation. That's quite cool. So how does this apply to your newborn photographs? Well, as a newborn photographer, part of our job does involve retouching a newborn skin. This is because we shoot for sharpness. Our professional gear, and whether we use studio lights or natural light, does invariably pick up all the little new blemishes of a baby's skin that wouldn't necessarily show so much to the parent's naked eye when they're holding their baby, or even on mobile phone photos. But as professionals, when we take these professional style photographs, it is inevitable that we will pick up some of these very, very temporary spots, scratches, little cuts, bruises, anything that wouldn't normally be on baby's skin. As professionals, we can see. Even things like little hairs, hair out of place, bits of fluff, flaking skin, and milk spots. There are certain parts of a newborn that I don't like to touch. I adore flaky feet and hands. I think that's part of being a newborn. So unless something is peeling and hanging off and doesn't look particularly appealing in a long-term photograph for the family's wall, then I would leave it there. But things that, bruises where the baby here has scratched their face, which is quite common, anything that perhaps has come up that day, as we know, you sometimes get parents who come in and say, oh my goodness, yesterday they were fine, today they've broken out in this rash. Baby's skin is obviously adjusting to being out of the womb. It's adjusting to the hot and the cold air, and baby themselves is adjusting to feeding, to routines, to washing powder, to all the different people touching and handling them, and this can result in kind of little flare-ups, rashes, scratches and bruises in the first couple of weeks of baby's life. And as professionals, we shoot for sharpness, like I said, so we get the lovely eyelashes and the lip detail. This also means it really magnifies any little spots, dots and scratches on baby's skin. Most babies, you can fix this by using the spot healing tool, the patch tool, the clone stamp, your own kind of preferred methods of fixing. But what if you want to go in and make the fix a little bit more natural? That's where frequency separation comes in. You may find once you've done your normal edit, once you've corrected the exposure and the white balance and the tones and the colours of your image, you may find that the skin actually doesn't look as harsh as it does on your original photo. I'm going to do a very quick edit here using the LSP Signature Newborn Collection. This should take just a minute or so. If you don't want to wait, you can feel free to skip the video on a little bit so we can start talking about frequency, because like I said, I do tend to ramble even though it's not intentional. So for those of you who find my voice annoying, I'm sorry. Perhaps I'll subtitle this. Okay, so I'm just running the LSP Signature Newborn Collection super quickly, just to give you an idea of a base edit. Obviously, if I was doing a proper edit, I'd spend a little bit more time concentrating on this, but I know you really don't have time to sit around and watch me edit. I'm simply doing this edit first so I can show you the difference a base edit can make to your image and the newborn's skin. Okay, so I'm just taking some of these reds out now because the camera has picked up a lot of the reds. I've gone in quite heavy with that one, so I'm just reducing the reds. I'm going to paint away some of the yellow that has left. Okay, and soft skin. This is a very mild skin softener. This doesn't actually take away any of the texture of baby's skin. It just softens down naturally. So let's see. So that's before and after using the Signature Newborn collection. Like I said, that was just a very, very quick edit just to give me a base to work on. So I'm going to flatten that one down. Okay, so once you're happy with your general edit, you can then zoom in and have a look at the skin, and you can decide yourself if you think it's worth using frequency separation or not. For certain things, if there's just a few small patches, then you don't need to. You can use a spot healing brush or patch or clone. But for this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use frequency separation. Okay, so first of all, let me explain frequency separation a little bit. I first started using frequency separation around 6 or 7 years ago when I was a graphic designer. I still do graphic design projects, but not so much now. I'm a very busy newborn photographer. I worked within the music industry. And we called it airbrushing back then. I think it still is called airbrushing, but this is basically frequency separation. And I used it on models' skin, on images when creating cool graphics and vectors for album covers and posters and things like that. Frequency separation on newborns is a lot less heavy-handed, and even though it uses similar principles to the fashion and music industry, we do kind of have a different approach to newborn frequency separation. So first off, flatten your image and duplicate the layer. Let's call this the tones. As I said before, the tones are flattened in the, where is it? Oh, it's gone now, I've lost my layer. The tones are flattened or are created in a low frequency layer. That's the tones. So we've got our little frequency here, and we come out frequency, that's the tones. Separation is the textures. So I'm going to create the tones here. I'm going to duplicate that layer again and call it textures. The tones are basically the colours in your image, and the textures are going to be what they say on the tin, the textures. So I'm going to make that one invisible for now, and we're going to work on tones. For this, I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. So you go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and you can play around with this. You basically want the blur to kind of blur out all of the texture on your image, but keep the the integrity of the colours. I tend to go around 13, and like I mentioned before, there is a frequency separation action by LSP by myself in the Signature Newborn collection, in the Parent Retouch collection, and in the Forestry School collection. Okay, so that's the tones layer. I'm now going to make textures visible again. And to create the texture layer, we're going to do something really interesting, and I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. We're going to come up here to image, and we're going to hit apply image. Apply image is a it's kind of more, I guess, was first used for graphic design term. It basically means you're applying one image to another. You're mixing two images together, and you can decide on the parameters of that mix. So I'm on textures, as you can see here, and I want to apply textures to tones. So I've clicked on textures, and don't worry if I'm losing you a little bit as well. All you need to do is make notes of the things I'm clicking if it's a little bit tough to understand. So go on to textures and hit apply image. Okay, so this is where we start. The source is going to be your image that's open. So make sure that your image here, it will come up with the title here. Make sure you select the image that's open. The layer, you want to select tones, or whatever it is you called your tones layer. See how this is blurred a little bit now. Selected the blurry tones layer. Channel RGB, yes, you want to select RGB. Leave the others, unless for some reason you have anything that is transparent that you want to keep transparent, and select transparency. But no, you want RGB. You want it to invert, and as you can see here, I'm going to put that down to 1 because that's where it will be when you start. As you can see here, the image will go white. Unless you have other settings, your image will go white. Okay, you want your blending mode. Now you can see here the image is inverted because it's applied one to the other, and it's inverted. If I take that off, it just looks like just the tones layer. Inverts the image, as you can see here. Blending mode, you want to set this to add, not subtract. You want to select it to add. and that will make your image go very white. Basically, the pixel values in an image are range from 0 to 255. 0 is completely black and 255 is completely white. When you select add, you are adding the pixel values of one image, textures, to the pixel values of the other image, tones. So basically that is going to give you a higher number, which results in a brighter color because 255 is white. So we are making an incredibly white image here. So to change that, scale means how much you divide that pixel value by. And like I said, I'm sorry if I'm losing you. I'm just trying to explain this as well because I think sometimes, knowing which buttons to click is great, but knowing how something actually works will set you in really good stead in the future for using things like this. So the scale, this is set to 1 at the moment, which means the add is at 1. If I put it up to 2, it will divide that number by half, which basically sets it back to 0, which will give us an absolute 50% grey image. There. So now the image is made up mainly of 50% grey. The darker areas are lower than 50% grey, and the lighter areas, here we have some kind of very bright whites, are higher than 50% grey. The opacity, you want that as normal. You don't want to hit preserve transparency or the mask. And you want to leave the offset as it is. Offset only is really relevant if you're trying to make an image darker or lighter, so leave the offset where it is and hit OK. So now our textures layer looks like this, and that's not very usable, is it? That's not very good. But if we zoom in, I'll show you. We have the textures separated, so you can see the little spots are set as highlights here. The scratches and the spots and the dots here are set as highlights and shadows. So here's where the interesting thing happens. With your texture layer still selected, come up here to the layer blend mode, and you want to come all the way down here to linear light, not to get confused with linear dodge. Linear light is basically a blend mode that it basically is good for, well, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. I should have scripted this. Okay, so it basically will darker any areas that are darker than 50% grey, and it will brighten, it will dodge any areas that are lighter than 50% grey. So it kind of creates a dodge and burn layers based on the levels of greyness in your image. So you select linear light, and that bang goes back to normal. So the image looks like we haven't actually even done anything now, but we know on our textures here we have a textures layer, add a layer mask, and a tones layer, add a layer mask. I also like to add a new layer, let's call it paint and clone. Between the two there's a blank layer there. I'm going to select textures, paint and clone and tones and put them into a group, and let's call this frequency separation. Okay. So let's have a quick recap. If you've got a pen, this is a great time to make some notes. If not, you can just skip back to this part in the video or pause it to make your notes for frequency separation. So step 1, create 2 copies of your background layer. Name one copy tones and the layer above it, name that textures. And then you can add a blank layer in between if you want to, or you can do that a bit later. Step 2, select the tones layer and add a Gaussian blur. I like somewhere between 10 and 15 pixels, but it really does depend on your image, how big the face is in the frame. So you can play with that setting, slide it up and down. You basically want to blur out all of the textures and all of the details, but you want to keep those colors. You don't want it just kind of one big blob. You still want to be able to see the picture if you stand back. Step 3, select your textures layer and go to Image, Apply Image. And then you're going to add the following settings. The source is your original file name, which it will be. I don't see why it wouldn't be. The layer is going to be tones, so you need to go on Layer and select Tones. Next, the channel, RGB. If it says something different, change that to RGB. It shouldn't be CMYK or anything like that, unless you're working in CMYK. So 9 times out of 10, double check, but you are in RGB, change that to RGB. Tick the little box next to it that says Invert. And then on where it says blending, scroll down near the bottom to add. You want the scale to be 2, which will divide it by 2 and give you that nice grey look, and hit enter. And then the last step is change this layer, this texture layer, change the blend mode from normal to linear light. The blend mode, you can find it kind of just at the top of your layers palette where it says normal, hit the drop down box and select linear light. Now pop your frequency separation layers into a group. That's your tones, your textures, and your blank layer if you have one. And you can now begin your frequency separation edit, and I'm going to show you how. So now we have our frequency layers set up. Let's open the group and actually figure out how to use frequency separation. And like I said, frequency separation separates the tones and the textures. So if I make the tones invisible, we can see we just have the textures layer here that we created. If I make textures invisible, you can see we just have the tones. You zoom out enough on the tones and the image looks fine, as it did with my frequency separation text. So let's get started. I'd always recommend starting on the tones layer, starting to correct the tones, because you may find with the less destructive tones correction, a lot of the textures sort themselves out or look mild enough, to still look natural, because going for a natural look is one of the best things about frequency separation. It allows you complete control over your level of editing and, removing skin imperfections and anything that wouldn't normally be there. And when it comes to correcting the tones, there are 3 methods I like to use. I like to use the patch tool with Gaussian blur. I like to use clone stamp, or I like to click on here, paint and clone, and lightly paint over with the colour. So let's get started first. The easiest way of correcting tones is, areas like that are quite red, or, strong shadows that you want to minimize in the case of, say, blanket wrinkles or anything like that, is to come up here on your spot healing brush menu and select patch tool. Now I can see there's some redness here, so I'm going to draw around the redness. And because this layer is quite blurred, I want to feather that selection. So select, modify, feather. The level of feather depends on how much you blur. I'd say go around half of what your Gaussian blur was. So say we went for a Gaussian blur of 13, we want to feather at around a 6.5 radius. And then come up to here, filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and increase the blur. As you'll see here, you'll have a bit of an outline, so bring that down, but you want to increase the blur so the red starts to blur away. I'm going to make textures visible so we can see what we're working on. So if I deselect and turn that on and off, you will see the redness has automatically disappeared. You can also just patch using patch tool to an area of colour you wish to replace it with, but you just need to be very careful with these hard edges here that you're creating, because you're on a very blurred layer. You don't want any hard edges here. The next step is to come up here to your clone stamp tool, or hit S. Take the flow right down. I'd say maybe a 5% flow on 100% opacity. If you're unsure of the difference between flow and opacity, please watch my tutorial on flow and opacity. Basically, flow is the speed in which the paint comes out of the brush, so if you hold it down it will build up. Opacity is kind of a cut-off point, so say you've got a 20% opacity, the amount of time you have your mouse held down will just come out at 20% opacity and no more. You have to click off and on again to create another layer of opacity. So I'm on the clone stamp at 5% flow. I'm going to sample from about here, and nice and soft I'm going to start cloning over this red. Because I'm on flow, I can keep my mouse held down and take it off as I wish to build up the flow. The same for these red patches here. As you can see, I'm just holding down and going over them. Those of you who have the LSP Actions, the Signature Newborn set, the Parent Collection, Studio Retouch, or Forestry, you will find you already have frequency separation built in, and this has another few really cool tricks on there that I will show you in a moment. So let's see how that's doing. So I think we're doing quite a good job of getting rid of these red blotches, which is also already minimizing the redness of the skin. The third way I like to correct tones is to come onto the paint and clone layer. Hit B or go onto your brush tool, and again you want a very low flow, maybe 5% again. And so let's tackle this redness on the eyelid. I'm going to select an area of skin tone that I'd like to replace it with, so say up here, and make a nice small brush, and I'm simply going to start painting over. If you find the flow is too much, you can take it down even more, but remember to keep an eye on your shadows and highlights. You don't want to be painting over a shadow with lightness unless you're trying to replace the shadow itself. So let's change this red here. I'm just going to start colouring in. I'm going to get a bigger brush for up here and start coming in over this redness. So as you can see now, we are really starting to paint away the red areas. So let's go on to the textures and come in. Textures are areas like spots and flakes, scratches, or anywhere like that. And the easiest way to replace the textures, there are two ways of doing this in fact, but the easiest way I find is Patch Tool. Simply select the area you want to replace and drag it to an area you'd like to replace it with. So say these enlarged milk spots on the nose, I will replace those. Small milk spots that haven't become large, are really sweet, and I would personally leave those in. So I'm simply dragging away the spots and the flakes and anywhere else I'd like to replace. So we can see here we have a bit more around the nose. I'm simply patching and dragging. Another way of doing this is going on your clone stamp, but make it hard, not soft, because the textures is a hard layer, and keep the flow down low. I'd make that maybe around 80% hardness, and you can use a clone stamp to build up. It's entirely up to you. I personally find Patch Tool much easier and quicker and less destructive, because when you're zoomed in on a clone stamp, sometimes you can think something looks really great, and then you can zoom out and go, ooh, what did I just do? Okay, and back to the tones again. Let's just figure out these last bits of tones, these last bits of redness here. So let's see how we're doing. So already we've cleaned the skin up a lot. And at this point with this edit, I would get on with my normal edit. I'm going to get rid of that frequency separation completely and go back to normal. And I'm going to show you the LSP frequency separation action, because this has a few extra bits included. So I'm just playing the action, and it comes up with these instructions. Open the group, your image is split into two parts, tones and textures, which you already know. But as you can see here, we also have a dodge layer and a burn layer, which are both very, very handy. Dodge means lighten and burn means darken. So you can paint on these with a white brush and lighten or darken the shadows as you wish. And here is another cool trick. You'll see here, this has gone out on the new update today. So if you've just purchased the newborn actions, you will have this. If you previously purchased them or any of my other actions, you will find this in your new update, which will be sent to your inbox, because I never charge for updates. You also have frequency separation tone, select and fix, and frequency separation textures, select and fix. So let's say we're going to go on the tone, select and fix. And what this does is the Gaussian blur trick I showed you earlier, but an awful lot less clicking for you. So you just select the area you want to fix and you hit tone, select and fix. There we go, and you can hit it more than once if you want to, and because you're on patch, you can patch out the way if you need to. So that's a really, see this redness here, that's a really good way of fixing the tones, and it's super quick. So we see all these little spots here. I'm going to hold down Shift and select them, and I'm going to play slow tones, select and fix, and they are gone. And again, tone, select and fix. Drag those out the way there. Anything that doesn't disappear with tone, select and fix, you can go on textures and play textures, select and fix. Sometimes what I like to do is select several areas that I want to fix. So here I'm holding down Shift and the patch tool to select these areas here. I will click on tones, tone, select and fix, click on textures, textures, select and fix, and that will get rid of both sets on both layers. So it's rather quick and a quicker way of of doing it really. But still use your clone stamp, still use your brush, depending on the area you wish to fix. Different methods will have different results. I'm going to go on textures, select and fix here. So I'm simply selecting and clicking depending on whether I'm on textures or tones. So really kind of simple. You can just get a bit hypnotic about it and just kind of clickety click, all done. So the redness here, I'm going to go on to tone, select and fix. Click on the tones layer, Lauren. Tone, select and fix, and this will just start taking some of this redness down. See where we were before and after. We have kept the original texture and the integrity of baby's skin, but we've removed the blemishes and the temporary spots and scratches. I'm going to pop this here on top, so there is our frequency separation layer. You can then flatten, and you can, finish off your edit as you normally would, do whatever you would. But like I said, don't jump straight into the skin fixing. Do your normal edit first. So I'm just popping a bit of contrast there, soften the skin down a touch more, and I'm going to sharpen the lashes, and then this picture is done. So I'm sharpening the little details up again now, just to put one final detail sharpen on there. I'm going to soften the skin a little bit more. And I'm just going to reduce the reds, just to get rid of these last red patches on baby that shouldn't be there. This is great for fingers and toes, red marks, ears and things like that, that maybe because baby's a little bit warm in the studio, or maybe just because, just because. Okay. And one more, I'm just going to pop a tiny hint of brighten on, and then I'm done. Okay, so that was our image before. This was with frequency separation and the rough skin edit, and that is a quick finisher. And that is how to use frequency separation and how to set up your own frequency separation layers. Okay, so this layer we have some blanket creases. I'm going to play frequency separation. Obviously, of course, you set up your own layers if you don't have frequency separation with the LSP, which is absolutely fine. Same difference. And on the tones layer, I'm going to select the patch tool and get rid of these blanket creases by dragging them to a smooth area. Because you will find a lot of the time blanket creases are caused by shadows. So all you want to do is drag those shadows away. And you can see here you keep the original texture of the blanket, which is really important. If you were doing this without frequency separation, you'd be either cloning or painting, and it would ruin the original texture of your blanket. So that is frequency separation to get rid of blanket creases. What else have I got here? I've got a few here. Okay. Stretch marks, pregnancy, stretch marks. Let's play frequency separation again, and we'll be mainly working on the tones layer and then cleaning up the textures layer afterwards. So I'm going to get patch tool, and I'm going to select some of these areas and simply drag them out of the way. Depending on the type of text marks, stretch marks you have, you will use a different technique. So here, down here, I'm going to use the frequency separation tone select and fix, and if you don't have these actions, that is putting your own Gaussian blur and feather on the selection. The good thing about this action is you can play it several times until you're happy. The first effect will always be quite mild. If you're not completely happy, you can play it again. So frequency tone, select and fix. And as you can see, we're just left with the stretch mark textures now. This is kind of how stretch marks will go. If any of you have stretch marks, this is how they go after a while when they fade down again. So it's almost like you're left with some little stretch mark scars. So I'm just moving all the, as you can see here, I'm just going to get a very soft clone stamp, and I'm just going to finish off and tidy up this edge here with a soft clone. Always worth checking if you've got any hard edges going on in your tones layer, because you obviously don't want hard edges at all, because it's a blurry layer. So I'm just tidying up those hard edges there using a clone stamp on just 5% flow. Okay, let's pop our textures back on. So as we can see here, that's already made a huge difference, but we've kept the original skin texture. And now all we need to do is get the patch tool and just remove these harsh lines here by patching them to an area of skin that still has nice texture, but that is not lined with stretch mark scars. You can also use the frequency separation textures select and fix as well. Like I say, what you use all depends on your methods, what you're most comfortable with, and what suits your image the best. Areas like this, I would really recommend zooming in and replacing the texture here because you've got quite a hard edge and you don't want to ruin the edge of your image. If you've got a pregnancy model in and they have stretch marks, I would always talk to them about whether you would like whether they would like you to remove the stretch marks or not. You will find some mums are incredibly proud of their stretch marks and will take great offence if you remove them. So I would not recommend removing them unless you have permission from your model, because they may say, hey, where have my stretch marks gone? So in here on the textures layer, you want to make sure you have no blurry areas, no odd areas. You want to zoom right in and make sure your texture lines up beautifully. So there is our after. I'm just going to sort this area out very quickly here using tone select and fix. Okay, so here is our frequency separation, there is before. So how to remove stretch marks or scarring or anything else. As you can see here, I don't know how good the quality is, but you can see the skin texture has not been affected by removing the stretch marks. And the same with blanket wrinkles. So I hope that's helped. That is how to do frequency separation in Photoshop for a newborn. Lots of different techniques there. You don't have to use all of them. The most important thing is the way you set up your frequency separation, and then understanding the difference between your tones layer and your textures layer.